when COVID hit, we were all kind of at a loss, and I think for people working in the field of photography, there were extra challenges, which was, are photographers going to be able to photograph? Are they going to be able to make a living? Are they going to be able to photograph safely? What is it going to take for them to do that? And those were all questions that various organizations were wrestling with. And we were lucky enough, I think, as a field to come together with other organizations very quickly. We talked to Women Photograph, we talked to Authority Collective, we talked to the Open Society Foundation, to Magnum, to Seven, and we said, okay, what's going on and what can we do together? And so, along with Tara Pixley and Martin Smith-Roden, we decided to start like a quick survey of what was going on in the field with photographers as COVID just started to hit. And when we got those results back, we realized that actually we needed to dig a lot deeper because there were really big systemic issues coming to bear. And so last year, again with Tara and Martin, we decided that we would issue a really broad survey of the field and try and get as many photographers and visual storytellers to answer this survey as to what is their, economic conditions, what is their access to health insurance look like, and a lot of other questions. So I'm inviting today Tara Pixley to share what has come out of this survey and this really important research project, along with CatchLight Global Fellow Daniella Zalcman, who is also the founder of Women Photograph and has been pushing the field towards more equity for years now. Please welcome them. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just getting situated with the clicker here. Excellent, it works. Okay. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak with the brilliant Daniella and also to speak to you all today about this work that we have been doing. I want to give a quick kind of background to the state of photography and this particular project and study. So I cannot say that it was entirely our idea. I want to always give credit where credit is due. And we're actually building on the State of News Photography report that World Press Photo initiated in 2015. So there were a series 3 reports, 2015, 2016, and 2018, that World Press Photo worked on with Reuters Institute and also University of Stirling in the UK. And that was overseen by David Campbell, Adrian Hadlin, and Paul Lambert, scholars working in visual journalism and in research in the UK. And they found some really concerning statistics. A couple things that are important to keep in mind, though, is that those reports were surveys of photographers who were submitting their work to the World Press Photo's award, their yearly award. So those, the statistics that came out of those 3 reports and from those surveys were specific to the photographers who were submitting to that award. And we found a couple interesting things about the demographics, specifically of photographers working around the world today. And one of those things was that 85% of those photographers were male. And I think that created a lot of concern and interest, and anytime you get a statistic like that, people can kind of rally around it. And so up until that point, we'd kind of been saying, and by we I mean women and non-binary photojournalists, saying, hey, there's a gender imbalance in this industry. And Danielle, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you experienced that or what you were thinking about those reports when they came out.
Well, I think especially when it began, I think part of the frustration is obviously there are many people before us, before our organizations, who have been saying this is a woefully undiverse industry. There are very dangerous ethical implications to that. But a lot of times people would either say, well, I don't think it's as bad as you think it is, or would negate because we didn't have real data. And to some extent, I think, as Tara said, the State of News Photography report was really important because it gave us some initial benchmark figures, but it's still a very specific sort of sub-survey of the photo industry. But at the very least, it was a starting point. And so we were at least able to start pointing to that. But I think we both collectively felt this is not good enough. We need more, and we need more specific data.
Right, so enter the State of Photography Report and Study 2022, which we've been working on since late 2020, actually. As Elodie very wonderfully explained, there was an original visual storyteller field survey that we got a little bit of data from, and we really wanted to expand on that. And some of the things that we were looking for in this survey of photographers was, one, to open up beyond news photographers. We wanted to understand, how are people working in a lot of different realms in photography experiencing this industry? And also, what are some barriers to entry? And what are some issues and disparities that are perhaps happening along identity baselines? Like, what does it look like to be a woman of color working in the industry, to be a trans person working in the industry, a person with a disability? Those were groups that were woefully understudied and underrepresented in any kind of attempt to really get at how is this industry treating people. So that's where we are with the survey that we're going to kind of walk you all through a few different findings, not all of them. It's a 42-page report, and I encourage you to go check it out. There's an executive summary that is just 2 pages that kind of explains a few things.
And there will be a test tomorrow.
Right, actually right after this talk, there's a test. So speaking of that executive summary, some of the things that we wanted to kind of foreground is that there were 1,325 participants, and those came from 87 countries. Now, this is really interesting, is that I mentioned the previous state of news photography through the World Press photo surveys found that 15% of those survey respondents were women, and for this survey, 49% of the respondents were women, identified as women photographers, and 46% were male, and 1.9% were non-binary. We did have a few folks who also identified as other, and we tried to make it as inclusive as possible for people to identify in a way that felt authentic to them. And this survey essentially is representing the first survey the first published and widely publicized survey and study that we know that's specifically looking to understand identities of photographers in the industry. So one of the things that I know this is near and dear to both of our hearts is really paying attention to pay disparities in the industry, to pay inequity. And we found that there was a glaring issue with a lot of that. So, I want to just kind of this isn't all going to be statistics. We'll show you the statistics, and then we're going to discuss what those statistics mean and what are the stories happening behind them. So we found that in general, photographers are not making a lot of money, right? So average 40 to 49,000, like 40 to 50K essentially USD. All of these numbers are in USD and after tax. And oddly, that people from marginalized populations, so people identified as women, non-binary, or people of color, were making about $20,000 less than white male photographers. And that people working in a sort of a non-Western context, or and we could certainly problematize the use of the language of Western and non-Western, and we do talk about that in the report. But people working outside of the North America and Europe, those photographers tended to make even less. So there's this clear disparity there. And I think we know that your financial circumstances, your socioeconomic background, that has a lot to do with access to photography. Oh.
And I think there are so many different barriers here. One is, how accessible is it in an industry that now relies heavily on freelancers? If you need to buy $10,000 worth of gear to even begin, if you have a significant student loan burden, if you don't have access to generational wealth, it can't possibly be a sound financial decision for you to need to invest and then maybe get assignments, maybe get jobs, maybe get work, maybe be able to pay your rent or not. So I think that is one of the most significant barriers. And then, should I go into the financial colonialism, or are we bringing that up later?
Yes, let's just hop on. Well,
Great.
Actually, I wanted to add to that. So, in addition to the kind of gear requirement, is what it takes to be a successful freelance photographer, is that you have to often, do your own advertising and marketing, make print materials, fly to meet with photo editors and art directors. There's so much like kind of implicit financial requirements and expectations to do this work. And I don't think that we talk about that enough, how difficult that is for people who aren't already coming from a wealthy background, who don't necessarily have networks of support and all kinds of resources that are necessary to make that possible.
And then I think that continues to be exacerbated, and particularly when we talk about, and again, problematic term, but Western and non-Western journalists, is we are seeing Western-based news organizations who have created a hierarchy of pay, where a freelancer working for, say, a wire news agency in the United States may be paid as much as 2 to 3 to 4 times what a photographer doing the exact same job, a day rate, an assignment in, say, a Southeast Asian or a West African country. And so we are reinforcing that that person's work is less valuable. I think the argument is often that, well, it's because they exist in a different economy, they have different expenses that they need to cover. However, if we were to fly a Western photographer to those same places, they would expect to be paid the same rate that they're paid in the United States or Europe. So I think we see and have had discussions about this type of colonialism in the context of labor, in the context of production of the clothing we wear. But we as a group of people who are expected to uphold the highest ethical standards in our work have to uphold those same high ethical standards in how we treat each other and pay each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that's also interesting about these numbers is that how is it working out that specific groups are being paid less, right? Like, where is that happening? And something that a lot of social science and cultural commentators and researchers and scholars focus on is the connection between socioeconomic status and race, and how a lot of times those things are tied together, and that is because of extensive histories of oppression and disparities and marginalization and subjugation. That's also happening in our photography industry, and we really need to kind of start thinking about what if we were more honest and open about who's getting paid what, how much they're getting paid. Are organizations actually letting everyone know what they're paying for various commissions and assignments? What kind of, I think transparency would allow for us to kind of get at this inequity. And another thing I don't think we've quite touched on that you can see here in this percentage is that 54% of the photographers surveyed were saying that they were carrying a great deal to a moderate amount of debt. And so that's another big thing, is that, for example, I just did a big corporate headshot shoot. I haven't been paid for that yet, but I had to get quite a bit of expensive equipment in order to do that. I had to pay my assistant, I had to pay makeup and hair. So when we're doing that, and now I'm lucky I'm in a position, or not lucky, I worked really hard to get to here, but for a very long time when I had jobs like that, I had to put it on a credit card. And so, and there are many people who are doing that just to get work, and we're not really acknowledging that. So I think this is what we're seeing in these numbers too, is that photographers are struggling just to do the work and going into debt just to do the work.
And it's either that reality, or we're saying in order for you to be able to become a photographer, you must have X kind of safety cushion in order to even get started. And that's not tenable, and that is a huge barrier to us being able to actually achieve these benchmarks that we know we have to achieve.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things, the next thing we wanted to talk about is, a quick thing about this. So we also noticed that there was a disparity with people who photographers who had access to health insurance. You can see in this chart here that the largest group of respondents who had the least amount of access to health insurance were Black photographers. 28.3% of Black photographers did not have health insurance, and also photographers from Latinx background, 16.2%. So I know this chart might be a little bit confusing, but these are the numbers of who did not have access. And then finally, thinking about pay disparity, is that 78% of the photographers who responded to the survey said that they believe that socioeconomic disparity limited a photographer's ability to succeed. So a majority of us working in this industry acknowledge that this financial inequity and pay disparities exist and is a problem. that means if 78% of people believe that this is an issue, we should do something about it. So we also were thinking about, okay, let's back up, just kidding. So I had mentioned before that this was also pay disparity along these sort of identity lines. And so we saw that women were paid $10,000 less than their male counterparts, and that this is also leading to almost half of photographer respondents who identified as women to consider leaving the industry. And Daniella has been working for years with Women Photograph to kind of compile a lot of the knowledge around, what does this look like for women in the industry?
Thank you. So I'm the founder of a tiny nonprofit called Women Photograph, and most of our front-facing objective is to create a database of independent women and non-binary visual journalists. We currently have over 1,300 photographers in the database based in about 120 countries. The idea is that every time a photo editor comes to me and says, well, I would hire more women if I knew where to find them, I can go, here, I made a list, thank you, use it. So that's our primary product. We also are a grant-making organization. We have an annual mentorship program that pairs early career photographers with one photographer and one photo editor mentor over the course of a year. And we have an annual workshop. But a really important thing for me at the inception of Women Photograph was to start building this data, because that's how my brain works. And also I like when people were coming back and saying, well, it's really not that much of a problem. You're overthinking this. It's not a thing. I wanted to be able to say, no, here are some hard numbers. And like the World Press State of the Industry report, this doesn't actually give us a good sense of how many women are in the industry. But this shows, we look every single day at the lead photo on the front page of these 8 newspapers: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Globe and Mail in Canada, Le Monde in France, and the Guardian in the UK. And write down that byline, we go through, we aggregate all of this data. And this was from the first year that we started gathering. I'll actually skip to 2018 because this contains the worst number of the 5 years we've been collecting this data. Shout out to my former contract employer, the Wall Street Journal, who over the course of all of 2018 had only 19 front page images. 5.4% of the images that made it above the fold on the front page of the Wall Street Journal were made by women photographers. This is abysmal. And it's a very specific, unique metric, obviously. A lot of people have asked me why this and not other things, and we measure a number of things. For 3 years, I tracked every week the photos of the week galleries that many different agencies would put out. We look at the year in photos, slideshows every single year. But I think this is critical because in so many ways, that lead photo on the front page of a newspaper is the thing that draws us to newsstands. It's the thing that we see first. It's the first thing we process sometimes even before we read a headline or a caption, is that image. And if that lead image, which we are saying is this is the most important piece of news for the day, if that is being seen almost exclusively by the eyes of cisgender men and largely cisgender white men, that's a huge problem for us. I mean, I know we're preaching to the choir, and we don't need to go into the exact ethics of why. And you can see just how slowly some of these numbers are improving, but they are improving at such a pathetically slow pace. The San Francisco Chronicle, by 2021, has actually been the first newspaper of these 8 to ever reach parity. I know it says 47%, but that actually is higher than the percentage of that little green sliver is the number of graphics and photo illustrations and things that we don't count. So the San Francisco Chronicle has reached parity as of 2021, but they are the only ones. And these other major newspapers that are informing and teaching the world about issues that they will never see themselves or interact with themselves are still at as low as 13% or 11% for The Guardian, made by women. And obviously there are a lot of extenuating factors and reasons to why this data is the way it is. For some of these newspapers, it's not necessarily the individual choices of these photo editors as to who they're hiring. Some of these publications lean heavily on the wires, for instance, who are doing a very, very bad job of diversifying their teams. So there are all of these other factors that go into this. But at the end of the day, and I think a resounding chorus for authority, for Women Photograph, for Diversify, for all of these affinity groups working together is just, what the benchmarks should be. What the objective is here. Set a benchmark and reach it. It's really that simple. And so we're just seeing year after year news organizations deciding that they're not going to do that, and that has to stop. Oh, sorry, just last thing. forgot last slide. And just again, math, numbers, my favorite. I wanted to map out this year after 5 years of collecting this data. We wanted to look at, okay, there is progress that's happening every single year, but at the rate we're making progress, at the rate of progress between 2021 and 2022, it would take us until 2057 to get to parity. And again, my friend made this very endearing graphic of a little old lady with a cane. I don't want to look like that by the time, I want to actually be working still in an industry where we reach parity. I'm not patient enough for this nonsense. So, we really need to pick up the pace here.
And we clearly have the data to inform picking up the pace. So another thing that we're thinking about is, we're seeing all this disparity, this inequity. What are some other areas that are creating that level of inequity? And I think that probably many in this crowd know that the last few years have been really hard for photographers, especially people working in news and editorial context. There's been a lot of staff positions that just kind of went away. Whole teams of photographers and photo editors have been disappeared, eviscerated, or from the newsroom specifically. And this move from staff photography to freelance photography opens up a lot of awesome opportunities, but it also means that there's a kind of crisis of resources. People don't have access to a lot of different things. And I like to think about it in terms of forms of capital. Like we have economic capital, the financial capital, right? And then we also have social or cultural capital, and we're losing in both of those realms. So we have this lack of consistency with pay. We're moving from staff to freelance. You are relying on money to come in not as consistently. And also there's this level of not knowing how much one organization might pay very differently from another, and you don't always know that until you get the contract, because you have that loss of social capital of being able to communicate with everyone else who's doing this work like you would in a staff situation, and kind of know inherently what is happening and have that community to work with. So we wanted to look at kind of how are people thinking about employment? What are the potential connections there with how the kind of photo work that people are doing now with this recognition of a move to freelance? And we've seen that photographers are doing a lot of different kinds of work to make it in the industry. And we see that here, that a lot of folks are working as teachers. Both Danielle and I are teaching college courses on visual storytelling. People are also working across photo and film and producing. There's a lot of writers. People are working in nonprofit work. And there's a lot of folks who are doing director of photography, cinematography stuff, research, data analysis, curatorial. So what we're thinking about with this is, what does this say about, one, the way that it could mean a few things. That folks aren't making enough money in photography to just do that alone. And also it can mean that photographers are really cool and we're really good at lots of different things, and we can work across these different spaces. But something that we were thinking about is how often photographers are made to feel bad about doing this, like different kinds of work. And how I've worked as a wedding photographer. I know many colleagues have worked as wedding photographers, family portrait, graduate portraits, doing those kinds of headshots and things, corporate headshots. And there's this level of kind of embarrassment sometimes around that work. And we think that it's important to push back against that. Like, people should do whatever work they're doing, and then also acknowledge that we're learning a lot from these different forms of work, and people need to be able to do whatever they need to do to eat, to put food on the table. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I was a bartender for 4 years. I was having a conversation with multiple people last night who also were working in the restaurant industry. I think it's actually good for all of us to do that at some point. But I'm teaching a class at the University of Montana, and I put up a slide for them at the start of the semester and said, these are all of the side hustles I have had over the past 15 years to make it as a photojournalist. There is no shame in any of them. You do what you have to do to survive and pay your rent, and then you orient yourself towards the work that you're passionate about and that you care about, and you always drive towards that, but do whatever you have to do. And I think that I encountered the same kind of sort of elitist stigma a lot early in my career of like, oh, you've done that thing? Oh, you have to do this to work? And there's no reason why we need to do that to each other.
Yeah, in fact, I know this came up a few times at little like photo festivals and things. You're like chatting around the dinner table, and how are these people doing this particular work? Like, this is wild. They're managing to travel all over the place, and you're like, oh, wedding photography. That's how they're doing it, but that's kind of hidden, right? So, and also this is making me think of another thing we were talking about, how we often just don't know how careers in photography happen in general, and that lack of like transparency around how to make it. I love that you did this with your students, like just being really honest about, this is what I have done to make it. And I've had guest lecturers come and speak in my classes to talk about their experience in visual journalism. I had this one, I won't name her, but she told an awesome story about how she was working as a waitress, as a server, and then she got her first job at ESPN, and then her career took off from there. But she always felt like she couldn't tell photo editors that she was a server. And that level of, like, people actually working their butts off to make it in the industry is pretty rad, and we should celebrate that instead of hide it.
And I think the flip side is, aspirationally, I wish there was maybe a little more honesty and transparency from people who do have help, who have access to generational wealth, to trust funds. I think now it's maybe uncool to have access to those things, and so people are much more quiet about it. But it really is frustrating, I think, for young photographers to look up to someone they idolize and be like, oh my God, this person just spent 3 years wandering around the globe, just focused on this really quiet story with no apparent connection to a funder or an organization. How did they do that? I am never gonna figure out how to do that. And the answer is, well, that person has a trust fund and it just hasn't divulged that. So, I think it's really easy to feel alienated and lost and like, oh my God, I can't make this work if you don't understand all of the different situations that photographers are currently accessing and have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, or I think a really important thing that we are speaking about across this wonderful summit is acknowledging that we maybe are in crisis, recognizing that healing needs to happen. And we can't do that without that recognition, right? And something that I thought was really impactful, and a little bit surprising actually, is that 78% and 75% respectively of photographers said that they agree that sexism and racism are problems in the photo industry. So again, like, if we are acknowledging that these are all issues, pay inequity, racism, sexism, and that a majority of us are being impacted by this, we need to do something about it, right? So we have a few suggestions. We've been dropping them throughout this kind of discussion. Also, where is the timekeeper?
I think we're good. We have 5 minutes before Q&A.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So a few things that we were thinking about. Oh, and we didn't talk about this, that another thing with the loss of social capital, something I've been looking at is who wins awards. And there's another forthcoming report and article about that. Like, who wins awards and who doesn't, and what are the circumstances under which, awards are awarded, and what it means to be a juror, and how those jury spaces work. And one of the things that is a benefit of being a staff photographer is you have this kind of built-in network. You have photo editors who help you curate your work and submit it to identify your best work. As a freelancer, you're often entering your work into awards and grants and things like that without that kind of network or support. You have to pay someone sometimes to edit your work, or a lot of people do have mentors, and that's wonderful, but many people also don't. And so not having that social capital and cultural capital to connect with people to help you move your career forward with things like photo awards and grants, because it does change the dynamic of your career and what's possible, who you have access to. So something that we saw also in this, I didn't put the statistic up here, but women and photographers of color were far less likely to apply for awards if they had a submission fee, an entry fee. And so we're seeing a big drop off in people of color's access to, photographers of color's access to these important components of your career, moving your career forward, because they cost money. And so we're not, that there's a pay disparity, pay inequity issue there.
And so we didn't talk about this, but I'm just going to throw it out there quickly anyway, because if there are people here who are on the boards of organizations that are grant making, that give out awards, where there is a $25, $50, $100 fee to enter, I joined the board of the Eugene Smith Fund about 5 years ago and was just, as I'm wont to do, going through tallying up the demographics of all the people who had been recipients of the Eugene Smith Fund over the course of the past 40 years that we've existed, and realized, unsurprisingly, it was majority white people, majority white men, and had a conversation with the board saying, look, there's a $50 entry fee. I know you are actively trying to outreach to photography organizations in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, but that's not going to make a huge difference if it costs $50 to enter, when for some people that might be a quarter of their rent for that month. And so we started a fee waiver system, and now we're able to distribute about 200 fee waivers a year. I know other organizations, the Arnold Newman Prize is now doing it, American Photography is now doing it, the Alexia, there are about a dozen different awards now that will do that. So I want all photographers here to know that if you see a competition and you think, I don't have $50 to throw away potentially on this thing, reach out to the organizer and ask for a fee waiver, because I think it's becoming very common. And if you run a competition, I would strongly encourage you to begin doing that. And there are a lot of organizations like Authority and Diversify and Women Photograph that will help you reach the demographics that you would like to reach.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a practice in academic conferences often where there's a sort of graduated pay scale. So if you live in certain regions of the world, you pay less to attend that conference. And because we're recognizing that this is based off of like a US or European system of financial kind of scales, and so acknowledging that there's global inequity written into that. Another thing, and I had mentioned this earlier, is that increased pay transparency. So just actually being more willing to talk about how much we make at different, through different commissions, different organizations, and kind of lose the stigma around that. An interesting other thing we noticed, or key finding in the report, or I don't know if this is a key finding, but I thought it was hysterical, is that millennials were like far more likely to offer their salary, like how much they made every year, than any other generation. Like we broke it down into generations. Every other generation was really unwilling to give their how much money they make. So there's this kind of interesting thing happening where that willingness to have pay transparency, and I think we're seeing that in conversations with the Photo Bill of Rights and that kind of demand for that, and Diversify Photos pay equity. Do you remember what it's called specifically? I want to say
Pay Equity Project.
Okay, yeah, the Pay Equity Project. So there's moves to make this happen, and I think we need to be supporting that, expanding that, and creating transparency across all of these spaces.
And I will add to that, I think historically, there has been, we especially when I began working, and I am imagining you felt the same way, there was very much the sense of we work from a place of scarcity. And so there was this lack of willingness to share that information with others for fear that it would mean that I wouldn't get as much work if I gave you a contact to an editor. I think the internal communities that have been created within a lot of these affinity groups has provided a space for people to start sharing information more enthusiastically and more readily. And so I think the takeaway is build your own community. Like find your community space, find your people, and use that group of people to pool information, resources, contacts, whatever that thing is, because that is the best thing for me that has come out of Women Photograph, is that now there's a group of people who want to help each other out. And I recognize that we don't always want to do that in a fully public space because we don't want retaliation or editors to get mad at us, but find your community and use that as a vehicle for transparency and sharing information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also recognizing the importance of community, that's something that came up in the survey and the study as well, is that there are more and more photographers seeking out and participating in communities, building communities, and many folks kind of nodded to the fact that that has been instrumental in being a photographer from a marginalized background, being a woman or non-binary or photographer of color. It's been really important to their career to participate in the community, and that's been really true for me and for a lot of my colleagues, I think. And that is a space where transparency can be built and things like fee waivers are happening. So expanding that more into the industry, I think, is the goal. And also we talked about normalizing and validating a lot of different kinds of work, just acknowledging that people get here through different means, being transparent about how you got here, and acknowledging that that's all great and cool and fine. And then finally, of course, valuing the work of photographers more by just paying fairly and on time. This like move to net 120, that's a hard no. We need to be at net 30 or below, pretty much everybody. And for, not to use like lingo, but for those of you who might not know, is that the payment terms of different organizations, editorial organizations or otherwise, often vacillate between 30 days after invoicing or 30 days after you've done the assignment or commission, and some people don't pay for 4 or 5 months, right? So, and a lot of times if you're a freelance photographer, you don't have the resources to come after organizations who are not paying you on time. So you're just kind of like at the will of people to do what they should do and what the contract said. I don't know about y'all, but I don't have a lawyer on retainer, so I need to rely on the actual ethical behavior of editorial organizations. So just really instituting that kind of recognition to value the work of photographers in the industry. We are wrapping up here and going to Q&A. Any other thoughts?
No, I think now we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience, so thank you all so much.
So questions, thoughts, concerns?
I'm curious if you think the future of photography will change moving forward, or is it pretty much kind of stay the way it's been and always kind of has been in a sense?
Just to repeat the question, you're saying, do we think that the state of photography will change or will it stay the same? I mean, I have a lot of hope. I think that that the communities that have been coming together in the last 5 to 6 years are pushing change. They're in organizations like CatchLight, many other organizations are working to shift the perspectives on how visual storytelling is done, who gets to do visual storytelling, who tells whose stories, right? That's coming up next, that conversation. And as long as we're talking about it, as long as we're recognizing those problems, we're moving toward a possible, reckoning with it. We're moving towards possible, I hate the word solutions, honestly. I know I put it on this slide right here, but we're moving towards possibilities, like reframings,
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I'm constantly stuck between a frame of mind of, oh, look how far we've come. We've genuinely come so far in 5 years. We have had so many important conversations that were not a given when I started out in the industry. And then occasionally I'm caught in a primal scream, but why is it taking so long? But we are making progress. I'm not a patient person. I don't think any of us are in this work because we know what the answer is and we just want everyone else to get there. But at the same time, the industry is so radically different from what it was like when I started. So I am optimistic that we're getting there.
Yeah. Other questions? Thank you for your question. We've got one here in the back.
So earlier, you mentioned several times, like sort of just the vanishment of, a lot of staff positions. Mm-hmm. And just like a few years ago, there was sort of a rash of, newsrooms being bought out by larger corporations, just laying everybody off, or, the moment there's talk of a union, basically firing everybody. And I was just wondering about your thoughts about, what the collapse of like unions, collective bargaining and all that have to do with perpetuating these issues?
Well, I am a hardcore pro-union person, so I'll just go ahead and put that out there. And freelancers, you need to unionize. Let's do this today. But I actually am not super familiar with the history of unions and newsrooms. And I feel like I've been hearing more conversation about that now than I ever did. So I could be wrong about this, but I feel like there's a more contemporary push to unionize and that is happening more so now than I had been aware of previously. So I actually think it's an awesome potential space. I know a lot of folks are doing really brilliant work to make that possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cannibalization of the local newsroom in the United States is a horrible, horrible tragedy, and it's having massive implications for all of us, not just people in those communities. And I don't think there are all that many unions, particularly for photographers, but there are very similar informal organizations that exist that do have a huge amount of collective power. And I think we have seen in multiple instances where, I won't name anyone by name, but when specific news magazines decide to change their contract to work for hire, that every single photographer gets together and says, we are walking, we will not work for you again unless you change this. So even if we have not specifically and formally collectively unionized, I think, again, community organizing is really the thing that we have to stick to and rely on. We have to talk to each other, we have to communicate, and we have to just understand that holding the line and having these collective goals are good for all of us and good for the industry collectively. So I know that's maybe not totally an answer to your question, but I do think that in some ways that is the answer. And yeah, formalized unions, also great, but most importantly, being in community and communicating with each other and working in our collective interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Like recognizing the value of community and like building community power. Of course, actual unions I think are really good because then you have that like institutionalized structural level of resources to make equity happen. But also just that informal community can really matter. Like something that I just thought of when you were talking about that is I didn't know before that like I could just push back against work for hire contracts. And I was giving a talk to this like mentorship class, and they were saying, yeah, like what do I do when I get a bad contract? And I was like, well, the first thing I always do is ask the photo editor, hey, did you know that this is a bad contract and I'm highlighting this area and this is, you know, trying to take my IP. I'm not sure if you're aware, maybe the lawyer just put it in. I always give them the benefit of the doubt. And most of the time people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that, and I have had that taken out. It's actually been a very rare occasion that people are like, oh yeah, I wrote that and you're giving me your IP. So, but I wouldn't have done that if I didn't have this community of folks who are like letting me know that I can do that and that I'm trying to pass that information on. And so those informal communities can really be useful in pushing back on unfair practices in general too.
Hi. Throughout your presentation, and thank you, it's been really brilliant, you've used the phrase "the industry," and I'm always one to question how you're defining in this survey and how the data has broken down, how you're defining the industry. I also asked a lot of questions around who the community is, but for this question, let's talk about the industry. And if you've taken your definition and the people who have responded, and then broken down the statistics into the different aspects of the industry and looked at how the statistics vary throughout all the different sources of pay for photographers from various entities. So the industry is my question.
Great question, thank you. We actually did struggle with that. You know, of course, the industry is like a huge sort of boogeyman and also just unclear. But I think that saying like advertising and commercial photography and news photography and, you know, like more editorial, those are also collapsed at this point in time. Like people who are working in the digital mode versus print, most of the people I know are working across a lot of those spaces. And we saw that coming up in the survey, is that folks are like, yes, I dabble in this thing and also this thing. So we're thinking about the industry, and actually let me not speak for any of my other researchers. I'm thinking about the industry as the visual media industry that uses visuals, specifically photography, to communicate ideas across a multitude of platforms. And I know that is a very big thing, but photography is used in so many different ways by so many different people that trying to understand all of these specific, you know, niches, I think is important work. We wanted to try and understand what is it to be a photographer. Does that hopefully answer? I also wanted to, I realized I didn't mention this before, I wanted to shout out Martin Smith-Rodden, who did the data analysis and was a constant, wonderful colleague on making this possible. And he's not here today, but thanking him so much for all of his work.
quick question. I was wondering if you guys have ever put any effort into looking at parity at the assigning editor level and at that editor level at all. I think there's a ton of effort looking at the photographer level, which I think is really important. But I also know that there's this like culture at the editor level that sometimes feels really intimidating, and it feels very, it just feels like this old school culture that is hard to break through and communicate with. So I'm just wondering, is there any plan to look at that culture as well in the future?
Do you mean parity in terms of the demographic makeup of editors? So I don't have that data. I don't think that has been part of.
Okay, so actually, the person I just mentioned, Martin Smith-Brodin, who is a scholar, a former photojournalist and photo editor at, I don't remember, newspaper from Virginia, and now is a educator in visual journalism. He's specifically looking at the photo editor data from this survey and building out a study and report around that, because we realized, like, kind of at the end that actually there was a huge amount of people who responded who were photo editors, and that we could do some really cool stuff thinking about that. And he already does scholarship around photo editors. He has a forthcoming article about like training needs assessment. He interviewed a bunch of photo editors, like what are you required to know in your job, and how do you learn those things and get access to those things, which is really awesome. And he also teaches at Kalish. So yes, he's gonna be the person who's doing a lot of that work. It just hasn't come out yet. And I also am really excited if anyone else is interested in thinking about that. Like, I think we should just kind of be like, all right, let's get together and figure out how do we study photo editors and figure out what that space looks like. How do we impact change there by talking about it?
And I mean, so we know that newsrooms are not diverse, and in the past 5 to 10 years, they have actually gotten less diverse, which is a terrifying prospect. And this is not a response to your question, but more of an addition. But I do regularly get asked, well, so, you know, every single major director of photography now, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic Time, like they are all women. So if that's the case, how come women are still not being hired at parity? And my answer to that, which also translates to any other demographic question, is it should not just be the burden of women photo editors to be assigning in ethical and diverse ways, right? Like, yes, I would say that shift is really only in the past 20 years. It is relatively quite new to photo desks, but at the same time, it's not just on women photo editors to be like, I'm going to be the one to fix this problem at my institution. So while at the same time, we absolutely need to diversify photo teams. Obviously, that's critically important. But also, male, white, cisgender photo editors also need to deeply believe in and contribute to this work as well.
And I want to add to that there's this really, I think there's a very cyclical thing happening in photography, especially news photography, where another stat that we saw in the study is that women and photographers of color tended to feel like they were not as prepared or had not been given the right amount of training to work in dangerous or hazardous environments. And we asked that question kind of around, like, you know, what risks are you willing to take, and how often do you feel like you have to take risks for your job, and have you been trained to take those risks? And there was a huge difference between women and photographers of color like white male photographers saying, yes, we have been trained well enough, we feel good about it, and like this group of marginalized photographers saying we don't feel like we have been trained well. So if you don't feel safe taking certain jobs, and then the industry rewards, gives awards and grants and accolades and more assignments to photographers who are taking risky assignments, then we're reproducing this kind of like masculinist, misogynist, like the more risk you take, the better photographer you are. We're also not preparing everyone equally to take the jobs that they need and want to take. So then we see, what photos get put on the front page above the fold, the images of people who are more in conflict, that's all just replicating this cycle that privileges primarily white male photographers who have access to those resources. So another thing we can do is make sure everyone is trained in a lot of different ways. And I think we're at time. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.